that out. Hey there, Night Owls. Welcome to a special edition of Delayed After Dark. I'm your host, Ducky.
And I'm Orion. On this episode, we're diving into one of the most debated moments in American history, a story that changed the course of the nation.
So, usually when we cover cases, or at least the last two cases we've covered, we've looked at it specifically from the criminal's perspective. But this episode, it's going to be different, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This time we're exploring not just a crime, but a pivotal moment that shaped modern America. On November 22nd of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now, I'm not as familiar with the background of this story, but you really are, Ducky. Can you walk us through it so that we can analyze it?
Absolutely. So, this story really starts back in September of 1963. On this day, a man named Wesley Frazier went to a book depository building down in downtown Dallas where he was going for a job interview with the superintendent of the depository, whose name was Ron Truly. During this interview, not a lot really happened, but Ron Truly really liked him and pretty much just hired him on the spot.
That's
So,
interesting.
yes. So after he had hired him on the spot, he went home and he lived with his sister at the time because financial situations were a little bit hard. So he was living with his sister named Linny Rondell. So fast forward about a month, Wesley Frazier came back from his job and his sister lived down the road from a girl named Ruth Payne. Now, Ruth Payne is not really that important to the story, but Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, Maria Oswald, was living with her at the time. A big stepping stone in this case is the fact that Maria and Lee did not live together. Maria lived with a girl named Ruth Payne who lived down the street from Linny Randall, who was the sister of Wesley Frazier, who had a job at this depository building. So
So it's kind
on
of a little
October,
bit complicated.
yes, it is a very circumstantial thing. And as we go on, you'll come to find out that it is more and gets more and more complicated, right? So one day on, I think it was October 14th, of 1963, we're about a month out from the assassination. Lenny is having like lunch, I guess it was. They were basically having a get together that they did every week at Ruth Payne's house, and Maria Oswald just so happened to be there. Lee lived in downtown Dallas because he was looking for work, and it was easier for them to be split up at the time. So Maria brings up the fact that her husband is not doing well in the work sector. She basically says, "Hey, is there a way that your brother, Wesley Frazier, is able to help me out or help Lee out?" Wesley says, "All right, cool, I'll go try to get a job." So he talks to the superintendent, Ron Truly, and he says, Ron Truly basically goes, "Hey, I don't have any permanent positions at this moment in time, but we can hire Leon as a temporary position while the school's system is in the beginning stages."
Sure.
So on October 15th, Lee and Wesley go down to the book depository building, and Lee gets hired on the spot. So already we're looking at a very, very circumstantial thing because a guy got a job and just so happened to live with his sister, who lived down the road from an acquaintance who was currently had Lee Harvey Oswald's wife living with her. And she just so happened to be there at the same time when Wesley was there and trying to get a job, and they just so happened to hire him. Right? So all these
So
could
these events were just kind of starting to fall into line, and it seemed like it was just like coincidental, one thing after the other was just falling in just so.
yes, it was one after another, and it's just kind of weird how it happened. So now we're gonna fast forward a few days, and basically In this book depository building, there was a bunch of just boxes everywhere, obviously, because their whole thing was repackaging books to send out to other people. I've worked at a repackaging plant. You can get lost in the sauce very, very easily. But in short, Lee eventually goes to Wesley and says, "Hey, can you take me over to this where Maria is staying at Payne's house because I need to go pick up curtain rods?" And Wesley Frazier basically says, "Absolutely, man. Anytime you want to go see your wife, that's okay with me." So he goes and takes Lee to Payne's house in order to pick up these curtain rods. Now, Maria had no idea that he was coming. The reason she thought he showed up was because they had an argument a few days prior, and she was under the impression he was trying to make amends. So they drive back to um, Wesley's Frazier's sister's house. Lee goes down the road, picks up these curtain rods, comes back, and by the time Wesley Frazier had come out of his sister's house to get back into the car, Lee was already sitting there with a box in the back of the car, right? Then they drove from there back to the book depository building in Dallas.
Seems like
He's
everything's a
at,
little bit hanky there that he would want to take a box of curtain rods back to work.
yes. So no one really questioned it though, because again, they didn't live together. He lived down in downtown Dallas, where Maria lived out in Irving, which is about 20 minutes away. So no one really questioned it. And of course, Frazier thinks that, hey, I am literally just helping him see his wife, and he's not going to stop that. So he takes the curtain rods back. And typically, whenever Frazier and Oswald would walk together before going into work, they'd walk together and they talk on the way to the door. This day, Oswald got out of the car and fucking booked it to the building. He didn't run, but he was definitely moving way faster and got way, way ahead of Frazier. And that really stood out to him, but he thought, hey, maybe he just wanted to get it over with. So
Fair enough.
now we have the curtain rods that are now inside the depository building. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit farther because now we got to talk about the motorcade route because that changes everything. The motorcade route was not decided until about 2 days prior to the assassination, right? So there was a point in time where they were saying, hey, there's not going to be a motorcade at all. And then there was a point in time where they were like, the very next day, they were like, hey, this is the motorcade, this is the route. So Oswald's doing all this stuff months in advance whenever there's not even sure if there's going to be a motorcade, or even if there was, they don't know the route.
That all seems a little
So,
bit hinky to me.
yes, the route plays a very big role in it. So now you got the governor of Texas, John Connally, who is also going to be in the motorcade with Kennedy. A lot of eyes got put on him after this because people thought that he proposed the route in order to take Kennedy in that direction, but he was actually very against having a motorcade. He proposed a completely different route that wouldn't have taken them past the depository at all. It was a much shorter route because the way the route ended up going, they were going to go down the interstate and add about 10 minutes onto this trip because Kennedy wanted to see and be seen by the people of Dallas, right? That was his whole thing. He wanted people to say, hey, I'm here, look at me, right? So John Connally was the governor of Texas at the time, and he was basically saying, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. I think this is a better route. Kennedy said no. Now, on the morning of November 15th, there was news articles basically saying JFK motorcade seems unlikely. That's the exact headline, right? And that was a few days prior to the assassination. And then on the 16th, They announced, hey guys, this is the motorcade. This is where it's going. This is the route. If you want to see the President of the United States, this is where you have to be at this time. So, Lee Harvey Oswald had already brought the weapon in at this point. He had already brought it into the um, depository building.
Which was what was inside the quote unquote curtain rod box, correct?
Yeah, yes, that is what the theory is that that is what was in the curtain rod box. Because the curtain rod box was never found, they just found a weapon with three shell casings. So, November 15th, morning of it, they say, hey, motorcade is unlikely. And then on the 16th, they announce, hey, this is the way the motorcade's going, right? So, now you are about a week out from this motorcade. This is where people started saying around this time that Oswald was acting weird. Nobody really ever got along with him anyway, in quotation marks. No one really disliked him, but people were saying how he didn't talk to a lot of people. He kind of just did his own thing. But
He
this
was like
day,
withdrawn.
yes. So this day, everyone was like kind of thinking he was weird. He was doing some really weird shit. He was taking some really weird routes through the building. And then another thing is, Lee Harvey Oswald in August of 1963, so about 2 months, 3 months before the assassination, he was on the news of how he was a Marxist. He wasn't a communist, he was a Marxist, and he said that there was a big difference, but pretty much during the Cold War, you saying, hey, I kind of aligned with Russian views, and I have a Russian wife, and he even denounced his US citizenship. Yeah, it doesn't look good on you, especially during this time. So, a bunch of people saying, hey, Lee Harvey Oswald's acting weird. So, boom, motorcade gets announced. Skip forward a few days because nothing really happened in between, right? It's the morning of the motorcade, and Lee Harvey Oswald was on the sixth floor, right? Again, people were saying he was acting weird. No one really ever saw him, but everyone was going downstairs because they wanted to be um, there on the side of the road when JFK passed. There were people looking out the window of the fourth floor and the fifth floor, but a lot of people were going out to leave. But at this point, Lee Harvey Oswald kind of just disappeared. No one really ever saw him, right? So,
That would make me wonder if it was me. If I'm trying to find a good spot to watch the president pass by, I'd be like, hey, why is this dude not giving a care? Like, it seems like he gives zero fucks about the fact that the president is going to be passing by just a few feet away from us in just a short period of time.
yep. And I'm talking like you could have thrown a rock out the window and, you know, hit him, right? That kind of weird choice of words, but So 11:45, that's about 45 minutes before the motorcade passes. 12:30 comes around and JFK is driving past the depository building. At that point in time, there were three shots heard and the president got assassinated. John Connally, the governor of Texas, also ended up passing away. And I believe one other person got shot and killed as well. Even though Kennedy was pretty much dead on the scene, they still took him to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Same thing with John Connally, where he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Right
And of
now,
course,
again,
they
like
would
I
need
said,
that official. They would need that official pronunciation.
yes. Now, like I said earlier, John Connolly was one of the first real suspects because of the route planning and that he was the governor. He just a lot of eyes were on him, even though he was not for a motorcade and was not having it, right?
Didn't he
So,
specifically say that he wanted a separate route, something that was might have added a little bit more
away from
time,
it.
but kept them away from the people?
Yes. So, now you have the President of the United States has been assassinated, and everyone's looking for who did it, obviously. So at this point, Lee Harvey Oswald fucking books it. He runs and eventually ends up getting caught in a movie theater, which is where another theory comes in later. But he gets caught in a movie theater. He gets arrested. And the entire time he's getting arrested, he's saying that he's a patsy, blah, 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 whatever. He's basically saying that he was set up. So that again leads us into the theory. But what for people who don't know what a patsy is basically a fall guy. He's just taking the brunt of the crime. So now we have the president has been assassinated. His assassin has been arrested. That happened on the 22nd of November, 1963. Now, fast forward 2 days after he'd been in jail on the 24th of November, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald is getting moved from one place to another, and he gets shot and killed. This sparked a lot of emotion from a lot of people because on one hand people were like, fuck yeah, the guy who killed the president is now dead, and the other people were like, now we have like nothing because we don't know why he did it, we don't know who he was with, right? We know
For sure.
absolutely almost nothing about this case now. So with Lee Harvey Oswald now being dead, a lot, and I mean a lot, of people start going under, right? So you have many, many people looking being looked at as suspects, a lot of members of Congress, a lot of members of the Senate. Kennedy was a very beloved guy, but not in the way that the government wanted him to be. So the people loved him, but the government didn't because he very much often outed many of the people who were doing crooked stuff in the government. So he gets assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson immediately swears in, and Lee Harvey Oswald gets shot. So that is where the facts of the case pretty much end when it comes to the basic rundown of it. Now we can move into a lot of the theories because there's a lot of them.
You make a really good point there, especially, we could start with the very basis of the Warren Commission that spent months investigating all of the aspects of the situation, and they concluded that Oswald acted alone.
Yes. So a lot of people, Oswald, the entire time before he was killed and whenever he was getting arrested, he was speaking out about how he was a fall guy and about how he was a like just a pawn in this plan. And then whenever it came down and he got assassinated, all of a sudden he worked alone, which obviously Frazier, his sister, and Maria were all became suspects because obviously someone that you're generally that close to, you'd think you would know a little about. No, they knew absolutely fucking nothing. Maria said that she had no idea that this was going to happen. She knew about how he was a Marxist and how he had denounced his United States citizenship, which is kind of crazy coming from someone who was a prior Marine, but he was not a patriotic person at all. So some people believe that the first theory is that he worked alone and the facts of the case were just the facts of the case, and someone who was just really mad that he killed the president and killed him. So that is
But
the first theory.
going on a little bit further in that theory and still dealing with the Warren Commission, didn't they say something about some type of magic bullet theory where a single bullet created all of the wounds in the situation and still managed to somehow come out intact?
Yeah, so that is like one of those kind of out there theories that people are trying to like dig for answers. That's just not a thing. At least from the amount of experience that I have dealing with firearms, never heard of it, never seen it, and I feel like if it was a thing, we would have seen it by now because this was back in the 60s, and it is currently 2024, and we have absolutely nothing from that. I feel like it would be a really good, useful indicator in war. But yes, that is one of the theories. But a lot of people kind of don't understand that he's a prior Marine. He Marines are riflemen first, and they spend a lot of time training in their rifle proficiency. So, and he fired off 3 shots really fast. So it is not out there to think that he could have done it just shooting 3 shots from really not that far away. The only thing is that it was a moving target.
And there's one other situation that seems to have a lot of followers and believers as far as theories go. And I don't know how I really feel about it, but whenever you bring up JFK and his assassination, so many people will go on and on about the grassy knoll theory and shots being fired from the grassy knoll behind the fence line near the motorcade. What are your thoughts on that?
So that is kind of a theory that I kind of buy into, but I don't think the person that was over by the grassy knoll, I think it might have been someone who was overseeing what was going on to making sure the job got done right. But I don't believe that any shots were actually coming from over there, simply from just the angle Kennedy would have got hit at. He got hit in the back, which could have only been done from where Oswald shot him at the 6th floor of the book depository building. So I think that maybe there was someone there, but I personally don't buy into that theory. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And as far as the trajectory is concerned, the trajectory shows perfectly and beautifully that the shots would have come from the book depository.
Yes, and again, maybe that's just the government trying to cover something up, which is another theory, but it just doesn't seem like Lee Harvey Oswald, like where he was at and it's not that far fetched. Plus, another thing was that I forgot to add earlier, JFK was not hit with the first bullet. He was actually hit with the second and the third one, but he heard the shots and he couldn't bend over because he was wearing like a corset to support his lower back because he had a history of back problems. So that does make a
Definitely
lot of
worth
sense.
noting, we didn't go into like JFK's younger life, but he has had always had back problems throughout his entire life and actually at one point sustained an injury during his college years that made him not able to play football anymore. And that contributed to the
Yeah.
back issues that he was dealing with later in life.
Yes, like he had a very, very long history of back problems. And then he was in the Navy, and everyone knows that the military years and dog years are the same thing. It takes your knees, it takes your back. So he didn't have a lot going for him there. So, but yes, he had a long history of back problems. One of the theories is that, so I guess it's less of a theory and more of like one of those historical coincidences. This is the Abraham Lincoln theory, or coincidence, where Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford Theater in the back of the head by a guy who went by 3 names. And, you know, I think that's like the gist of it. He was a guy who went by all 3 names. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln Continental, which is made by Ford, and his shooter goes by his 3 names and shot him in the back of the head and ran to a theater whenever he was caught.
That's an
And
interesting thing to look at, definitely.
yeah, and John Wilkes Booth, whenever he shot Abraham Lincoln, he ran to a barn which was kind of being used as a warehouse. So that's kind of where
So
the
many
similarities.
coincidences.
Yes, that's like a huge coincidental thing. So that's where a lot of people kind of get that the government had something to do with it because it was like, hey, we're kind of trying to recreate without recreating the Abraham Lincoln assassination.
It's funny that you bring up the government's potential involvement and the conspiracy theory regarding that because there is a decent faction of people that allege CIA involvement with Kennedy's assassination.
Yes, so that is a huge, and I mean huge, theory when it comes to JFK and the his assassination and with CIA involvement. The reason for that is whenever Lee Harvey Oswald got caught, the first thing he said was that I'm a patsy, like they set me up. So he went flip-flopping from the fact that he was a patsy to he did it alone, and then that he didn't do it at all. Like he flip-flopped a lot, and then obviously after doing all that, he gets killed shortly after by some random guy. And there was like I was saying earlier, everything was just so coincidental. Like his sister just so happened to be living next to a neighbor whose brother got a job at a place where the president was having a motorcade just outside of, but the route hadn't been decided yet. But you brought in the gun way beforehand, like you knew something was going to happen. So that is like one of the big things. And then especially with how JFK was so against government corruption. I understand when a president gets assassinated, but basically how fast they went from Kennedy's announcement of uh, him dying to swearing in Lyndon B. Johnson. So,
That is kind of weird. There's also a theory that there was some type of mafia connection because of Robert Kennedy's anti crime crusade while he was Attorney General as well.
so I've never heard of that. Do you care to explain more on that?
So, a little bit about what I read was because Robert Kennedy was seriously like anti crime, anti mafia, anti gang, anti violence thing that he had going on where he was trying to, lower the crime rate and etc. so on and so forth. Many people came together and kind of formed a little bit of a group, I guess you would say, to put out the word that they thought that because of Robert Kennedy's anti-crime war that he was waging, the mafia was trying to get in there and get, something on him, whether it be to hurt one of his loved ones, kill one of his loved ones, get some type of dirt or some type of foothold to fight back against his war on organized crime.
That makes sense. Another thing that plays into the theory of the CIA having involvement is because JFK was not the only Kennedy to get assassinated. All of
That's
them got
true.
assassinated.
Yep.
So that is why when you go to Arlington National Cemetery, him and his three or four brothers are buried right next to each other because all of them are in politics and every single one of them died or
And,
got
and
assassinated fairly quickly.
And you can't forget the fact that there is Russian background there. Like you mentioned, Lee Harvey Oswald's wife was a Russian woman and he had
Yes.
connections to the USSR. He had previously denounced his American citizenship. So there's
Yes.
people who theorize that the Russians may have been involved in this situation as well.
Yes. Which, again, that makes a whole lot of sense. To me, it does. That is why I'm kind of looking forward to this upcoming, I guess, 4 years. Not because like this has nothing to do with my political views, but Donald Trump said that he was going to release the Kennedy files to be able to see what actually happened.
Oh, snap.
Or at
That's
least,
something I hadn't heard of until you
yes.
just mentioned it. Tell me a little more about that.
So it was in an interview that he did a while ago. They asked him if he became president again, if he would release the Kennedy files and a few other files that just haven't been released yet. And he said he would. So I'm kind of looking forward to that because there's just so much gray area in this case that kind of just got kicked under the rug, and there's so many political figures that just didn't make a lot of sense. Um,
That's
like
absolutely
in
wild, considering we know for a fact that in the past, when Trump was in office previously and in between his times in office, he had no problem with getting out there and shouting out the truth about stuff and releasing, files that should have been opened up to the public years and years ago, decades ago, if you want to be completely honest. He had no
yeah,
problem with being truthful with the American people. So for him to say
yes,
that he wants to release the Kennedy files, that could open us up to so much information and we could revisit this again and talk about all of the Kennedys.
absolutely. But that's the thing is like with the Kennedys, every single one of them got assassinated, which that we um they look into. Well, they did look into. Um, But with Kennedy being the most recent of the presidents that have been assassinated to be assassinated, for those of you who don't know, the other two are James Garfield and William McKinley. But with him being the most recent one, in that it hasn't happened since. Obviously, there's been assassination attempts, but since it hasn't happened since, Kennedy basically kind of bumped up the Secret Service game, which is why there hasn't been a successful assassination attempt since, because the Secret Service has just kind of been on their A game since.
And we can
Obviously,
touch
there
on
have been
that for
other,
just a second. Sorry for interrupting
yeah,
you. We can touch
you're
on
good.
that for just a second. We can see visibly the changes in the Secret Service. If you want to bump back to just, what was it, a month and a half, 2 months ago on the campaign trail, when that kid got up on top of that building and started popping off shots at Trump at his rally,
Yes, yes.
Trump got hit, but not hit. He got grazed because he had good Secret Service, and his Secret Service operation had been tightened around him due to previous issues with previous presidents and those same presidents post presidency.
Which that is a different case that we can talk about because there's a lot of theories on that one too. Um, but the moving forward with the JFK case, a lot of people looked up to him, but he was kind of a wild-sided president, right? Like he was a nominee for the Democratic Party, but he didn't really follow their views all the way. He was more of an independent when you kind of look at it. Like he was really Democrat, but like kind of back and forth. So that he really kind of just outed the government while he was in there. A lot of people didn't like him because he was a playboy type president. He's the youngest president we've ever had. Like he just a lot of people didn't think he should have been in office because a lot of the older people who were in Congress and the House of Representatives didn't like him at all. And that's the
And
same
that
thing with
makes
Lyndon B.
perfect
Johnson.
sense.
Didn't really like him.
That makes perfect sense because if you think about it, when you have people surrounding you that don't like the way that you're doing things, things tend to happen quietly behind the scenes. And that lends a lot of credence to the possibility of governmental involvement in the assassination of JFK.
Yes. And following JFK's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson took presidency, which he had ran a few times prior and could not get the popular vote. Uh, he kind of paved the way for a lot of things, right? So there's another theory I kind of want to touch on. Oh, I mean, kind of going back to another theory, what do you think about the CIA involvement when it comes to like all the things we discussed so far, right? So he like knew a bunch of shit beforehand, all that, or do you think it was just a happy coincidence? Like, what theory do you buy into the most?
I'm going to fall back on, and this is going to sound so cliche, but one of my favorite shows to watch, especially with my youngest, is NCIS. And I'm going to fall back on an old Gibbs trope of there's no such thing as coincidence. There's no possible way that all those things could have fallen in line so perfectly, including, you know, Lee Harvey Oswald having the opportunity to bring a weapon into the workplace and stash it in the workplace before there was even an announcement for the motorcade. There's no way he would have had to known something in advance. And when I hear that he's like, when he got arrested, he's saying, I'm a patsy, I'm a patsy. I'm thinking that there was some type of governmental involvement, whether it was CIA, whether it was FBI, NSA, whoever it was. I don't really care who it was, but I feel like there was some type of involvement. And maybe while he was in the military, he did something or said something, or there was some type of event that happened that kept him in a situation where he kind of like owed one to the government that we might not know about. And I feel like they were able to draw on that and be like, listen, this is the sitch. We don't like this guy. You're going to take care of it for us and you're going to take the fall so that nobody knows that we did it. That being said, I also can't discredit the fact that, like we mentioned previously, Lee Harvey Oswald was in the military. He had marksman training, and he was kind of like a quiet guy. And it's always the quiet ones you have to watch out for. So he could have had his own personal beliefs that kept him in a situation where he was very against JFK's personal beliefs and the beliefs that he was putting out politically. and just so happened to be like, hey, I know he's coming through my town. Maybe I'll get this opportunity. I can't say that that is not the thing that happened, but I don't think that those things falling in line that way could possibly be just coincidence. I don't think that's possible.
Yeah. So I agree with that for the most part. However, I don't know if I buy. So I'm not saying that there wasn't a lot of government involvement, but to me, here's what my brain kinda goes to. I think that maybe it was just kind of a shot in the dark. Again, we don't have a lot of the information of like what anybody really knew at this time because it was flip-flopping back between there was motorcade, no motorcade. I try to kind of lean away from conspiracy theories for the most part because it's kind of a weird rabbit hole to go down. So
And
part of
there's
me
not
believes
enough
that there was
information.
CIA. Yeah, part of me believes that it was CIA involvements. Part of me believes that it was just he did act alone. And then whenever he got caught, he was looking for someone to blame or, you know, some people just do things just to get their name out there, right? Like, oh, I want my name to be in history books, so I'm going to take out the president. That's the surefire way to do it. And
Absolutely. His
I
name's
just
going to
heard
live on forever.
exactly. And with how deep the United States was in a bunch of different things at the time, like Vietnam, the space race, you know, it just making a power vacuum like that, which again, how fast they filled it is probably, it also feeds into that. I don't know. It just seems like it's a really weird spot in history to kind of take out the most important guy on the planet.
That is fair to say. Would I mean, I would ask what keeps people so captivated by this case, but you've put it in such elegant words and we've spoken so much about all the different theories and I'm sure there's even other theories that we didn't speak about. But this case continues to captivate minds over and over again, even though it's so long ago. I mean, come on, it's decades ago. But people are still captivated by the what ifs. And if we end up seeing the release of the Kennedy files, we might have the opportunity to get the answers to the what ifs. Do you think that might be part of what's continuing to captivate the American public?
So I think that is where a lot of people, uh, uh, the br- a lot of people just really like to kind of use their imagination. Like this, I think this case falls into the same thing that like Jack the Ripper falls into, the Zodiac killer, is that people like to just ask the what if questions and live in a world of wonder, right? So instead of going and being like, hey, this guy just decided to take out the president. He didn't. He obviously was not very patriotic. Why? Like he just saw an opportunity and he took it. This obviously falls into the same category as like Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac killer. Whenever I was taking a psychology class a few years ago, they my teacher always spoke about how not just the American lions, but people like to live in kind of this world of wonder, which is why nonfiction books and things like Harry Potter exist, Star Wars. People like to kind of use their imagination. And with these cases, specifically this one, having so much room for just what if, I think that's what keeps people so hooked into it, is that they have any theory you say could be proven correct. Like you can fight in it that way because we don't really have all the facts. Like, was Lee Harvey Oswald patsy? Yes, because he said he was. Well, no, maybe he's just like I said, maybe he's just looking to point fingers, right? Maybe he's hoping that if he points fingers at everybody or anybody else, something will stick to somebody and he gets less time in jail, right? Or so he can leave, right? So I think a lot of what keeps people hooked in this case is the fact that there's not a lot there that is set in stone.
That's a really fair thing to say, definitely. It's definitely one of those cases where everyone seems to have a theory, everyone seems to have an opinion about the case itself or other people's theories. It's a polarizing situation for sure. And I'm kind of wondering, maybe we should ask our listeners to give us their theories or their opinion on the JFK case. I definitely like to hear from our listeners What do you think about this situation?
Yeah, every comment is appreciated. We would love to hear it. We'd love to go through and look at it because maybe you're going to open our eyes to something that we've never thought about before. Um, and even if it's something that we just got wrong on here, and you're like, "Hey, you completely fucked that up," you know, all right, we're people. We live, we learn.
Definitely, definitely agreeing there. And we would love to see your thoughts dropped in the comments. You can always reach out to us at our email address that's in the description of all of our videos slash podcast episodes on YouTube and on Spotify. So we would love to hear from you. And also, we would really love to hear from you what cases you would like to hear us cover in the future.
Yes, like we said in our previous video, we kind of have a list that we're going off of, a vague list. Like, hey, boom, boom, boom. Like this episode specifically, we made it because, well, the anniversary of it is coming up, so we're trying to have the video out by then. Uh, but now I do turn it back to you and ask you this question. How different would you think America would be if Kennedy had lived and had served out the rest of his term?
I don't know. I feel like because Kennedy had so many beliefs and so many opinions that were so polarizing, I think we could see a very different America if he had survived or if there had never been an assassination to begin with. I feel like if he'd been able to live out the rest of his term and finish his presidency, we could have seen many things fall into place that are even like things that we have nowadays that were later on put into law, or different types of situations where the American people have more open voices for opinion. We could have seen our country become a lot more open and accepting of people and their opinions in general because of how opinionated and open about it Kennedy was.
Right. And a big thing that, so I think depending on which way this would have went, we would have been in a different place either way, right? Because the way it did go, we ended up where we are today, right? We, a lot of people were starting to lose commitment in the space race because, why would we do that when we're fighting a war, right? A war that, again, people didn't agree with. But, people were losing confidence in the space race, and Kennedy was all about the space race. He was trying to get us to the moon. He wanted us to land, be the first people to land on the moon, and basically tell Russia, hey, you can go fuck off, right? That
I
was
was
his
just
whole
thinking
thing.
that.
Yeah, that was his whole thing, right? He also was not a big fan of our involvement in Vietnam, and he was a really big civil rights activist, right? So I think if he did live, we would have been a little bit quicker when it came to the civil rights movement, and we would have been a little bit farther ahead in that sector. However, I think we might be a little bit farther behind when it comes to the technological advances that happened because of him passing away, right? So he got assassinated, and obviously, Lyndon B. Johnson's whole thing was, hey, Kennedy wanted us to get to the moon, so we're getting to the fucking moon, right?
Fair enough.
And the space race in Vietnam were kind of taking over TV at the same time. This is, if you watch the movie Fly Me to the Moon, it's definitely not a good movie, but it definitely highlights that area in time where people were split between hating on the war in Vietnam and hating the fact that we went to the moon. And the whole thing was the United States was trying to justify us going to the moon. Um, Even though technically by uh, really all accounts, we lost the space race. Um, we put we put the first man on the moon, and we have a flag up there, and they don't. So it sucks to be them.
Fair enough. So I think that's where we end it today. I think we have hit all of the important notes about this case. We've asked our listeners to join in with us and tell us what they think and join in with us, and please suggest future cases because otherwise you're going to hear all the stuff we want to talk about. So that's all for this episode.
I mean, that's where I think we should end it. If you have any opinions, just please drop them in the comments. You can always email us if you don't want it to put it in the comment section for whatever reason. The only
Some
thing
people
we
don't like
do
their
ask,
opinions being public, so we understand.
yeah, completely understand. The only thing we do ask is make it a case that we can research. Because if you give me a case that's from a town that's got four people in it, I come from a town that's got four people in it, you're not going to find anything on it,
You
right?
really
So,
do come from a town that's got 4 people in it. That's a fact.
yeah, yes, yeah. So you're not going to be able to find anything on the case. So just a case that we could have a basis to work on. Our next case is going to be another one of those ones that people just like to think about because there's nothing there.
I can't wait to discuss our next case. I don't want to give it away because I want people to come back for more. So I think that's where we're going to drop it today. That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'm Orion,
And I'm Ducky.
and this has been
Delayed After Dark.